Windsor Castle was not built to inspire, it was built to dominate. And that domination was not only through stone, through steel, but through a grand theatrical play that lasted throughout 1,000 years. We are always fascinated by the glamorous Gothic beauty, but the truth is, the majority of what you are looking at is merely a giant stage prop. It has drained the lives of countless poor people, driven kings to madness, and swallowed the darkest secrets of England. Today, let us peel off this golden mask to see what the royal family has hidden beneath the foundation of the largest fortress in the world. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Blood, Mud, and Anonymity. The years 1066 to 1070. The year 1066 marked one of the bloodiest turning points in the history of England, when William, Duke of Normandy, later known by the name William the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel and killed King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. He did not merely seize a throne, he plundered an entire nation. And history has proven, a nation seized by violence must obligatorily be maintained by suppression. The cruel siege ring around the capital William was not a naive king sitting and waiting for rebels to revolt. Within just 4 years after ascending to the throne, he sketched out a network of military structures to suffocate any intention of resistance from the native people. His strategy was incredibly precise and cold-blooded. The network of strongholds. He built a siege ring of fortresses around London. Each fortress was placed at a location exactly 1 day of marching away from the capital, and close enough to each other so that reinforcements could provide support in just a few hours. The pincer of death. If the Tower of London was assigned the mission to guard the east, then Windsor Castle was born to become the monster, locking down the west. The location of Windsor was not chosen randomly. It is situated on a giant white chalk cliff, more than 30 meters higher than the water level, allowing soldiers to control the entire strategic waterway on the River Thames, heading towards London. Not stopping there, this area was also adjacent to a vast hunting forest of the Saxons. What did William do with this piece of land belonging to the Cluer Manor of the Saxons? He did not negotiate. He did not purchase it. He confiscated it. The fortress built with blood and mud. If you traveled through time back to the Windsor Castle of the year 1070, you would not see any magnificent Gothic stone towers or gilded grand halls. The first Windsor Castle was erected from earth, mud, and oak wood. But the most cruel thing does not lie in the materials, but lies in the hands that created it. The first builders were not respected or paid artisans. They were ordinary Anglo-Saxon people, the humans who had just lost their homeland and were being dominated by a foreigner. They were herded to the white chalk cliff under the lash of whips, forced to hold shovels to dig a giant moat and use human strength to carry heavy baskets of dirt to build an artificial mound up to 15 meters high, about 50 feet. On the top of that sweat-soaked mound of dirt, the Normandy army erected a fence of sharp wooden stakes. At the foot of the mound, they surrounded it with 2 enclosed wall areas, the upper ward and the lower ward, which is the foundational structure that shapes the map of Windsor Castle up to this very day. This entire structure is a declaration of primal violence, written with mud, earth, and oak wood. It says to the native people that, "You have been subdued, and my presence here is permanent." The indictment from silence. The Saxon men forced to dig up their own homeland to build the prison, incarcerating their own nation, are anonymous people. Not a single line in the record books documented their names. They drained their strength to build a fortress for the king, who spoke a language that they did not understand at all, only to vanish completely from the flow of history without leaving behind a grave. The silence of the history books, in this case, is the most chilling record of the price of power. The first claw of the royal family had firmly pierced down into the layer of white chalk. But this was only the beginning. This crude wooden military outpost would soon be petrified, and from a tool of military violence, Windsor would stretch itself to evolve into a sophisticated machine manipulating the ideology of the entire kingdom. Chapter 2. The Petrification of Tyranny and the Crucible of Sieges. The 12th 13th century. Oak wood, no matter how sturdy, will eventually rot under the gloomy, foggy weather of England. But the greed of the monarchy never decays. If the 11th century saw Windsor as a primal roar of military violence, the 12th and 13th centuries witnessed that roar being cast into a permanent meat grinder. The monster made of mud and wood began to be petrified. The Petrification under Henry II, late 12th century. By the end of the 12th century, King Henry II realized that a wooden outpost was not enough to sow eternal fear. He ordered the tearing down of the sharp wooden stakes atop the white chalk cliff, replacing them with a material that was far colder, more ruthless, and permanent: stone. The first stone kept the predecessor of the deceitful round tower later on, and a system of solid stone defensive walls began to strangle the hill. But just like the dirt mounds of William the Conqueror, these thousands of tons of giant rocks did not magically fly to the top of the cliff. They were quarried, chiseled, and dragged by the exhausted physical strength of countless cheap laborers. The Petrification of Windsor was exactly the permanent freezing of the class system. The rulers sat atop an eternal stone fortress, while the ruled were forever crushed beneath the foot of the walls. The bunker of the cornered tyrant, 1215 to 1216. When the stone walls took shape, Windsor immediately proved its true nature: not a home, but a bloody bunker for dictators pushed to a dead end. Under the reign of King John, the most notoriously cruel and despised king in English history, Windsor transformed into a military crucible. In the year 1215, when forced by the rebellious barons at Sword Point to seal the Magna Carta at nearby Runnymede, King John considered Windsor his only safe lair. He huddled here like a wounded beast, frantically draining the treasury to hoard weapons and hire barbaric foreign mercenaries. Just a year later, in the summer of 1216, the castle faced its most brutal siege. The trebuchets of the rebel forces continuously rained giant boulders down upon the walls. Blazing arrows tore through the night sky. The castle was battered and scarred, but the monster Windsor firmly refused to collapse. It successfully fulfilled its mission to protect the life of a tyrant king, but the price paid was complete exhaustion and anonymous corpses piled high at the bottom of the deep moats. The stepping stone for bloodthirsty luxury, the 13th century. When the smoke of the sieges cleared, the successor, King Henry III, began to drape the first flesh of extravagant luxury over that dry, military stone shell. Henry III poured the sweat-soaked tax money of the poor to build a magnificent royal palace in the Lower Ward area. For the first time, this fortress was implanted with large glass windows, luxurious chapels, and frescoed walls. But this material luxury brought no peace. Henry III soon realized a bitter truth. Windsor had consumed mountains of gold. Its stone walls were so thick that trebuchets could not pierce them, yet it was still constantly eyed and besieged. The monarchy realized that, no matter how high the walls were, or how sharp the swords were, they could only control the physical bodies of their enemies. Through pure violence alone, the bloody rebellions would never end. The physical manipulation of the 13th century had reached its absolute limit. To survive, the British royal family needed a weapon hundreds of times more terrifying and sophisticated than soulless stone blocks. And that was when the 13th century closed, yielding the stage to a ruthless genius king of the 14th century, who would turn these stone walls into a religion that entirely imprisoned the human mind. Chapter 3: The Psychological Manipulation Machine and the Cult of Loyalty, the 14th century. If the kings of previous generations used swords, spears, and giant stone walls to threaten the enemy, then King Edward III, the person who was born right inside the castle in the year 1312, possessed a weapon that was far more terrifying and sophisticated: psychological manipulation. Edward III understood a cruel truth of power. You can force a person to kneel through violence, but for him to voluntarily dedicate his entire life to you, you must create a religion. And Windsor Castle was chosen to become the holy sanctuary for that religion. The Order of the Garter, 1348. The velvet-covered shackle. In the year 1348, amidst the context of incessant wars, Edward III announced the establishment of the Order of the Garter. the most prestigious order of knights in all of Europe. On the outside, this is an organization honoring the ideals of chivalry, glory, and knightly virtues. But hidden behind that glamorous shell, it is an extremely sharp political tool. By gathering the lords, the most powerful and dangerous warriors of the kingdom, together under a round table at Windsor, Edward skillfully bound them with ceremonies, oaths of honor, and extravagant banquets. The processions, the brilliant symbols, and the cloaks were not only for showing off. They were designed to turn loyalty into something tangible and make any thought of treason become an unforgivable sin. Edward III was not just a king. In the theatrical play at Windsor, he was simultaneously the director, the screenwriter, and the main actor, manipulating the minds of the entire elite class of England. The architecture of domination. For the theatrical play to maximize its effect, the stage also had to be redesigned. Throughout the last 2 decades of his life, Edward III drained the treasury to reconstruct the entirety of Windsor Castle. Under the direction of Bishop William of Wykeham, the castle put on an appearance that was muscular, full of militarism, and reeking of royal power. St. George's Hall was erected with an atmosphere so solemn and gigantic that it was suffocating. The height of the vaulted ceilings and the depth of the corridors did not aim to create comfort. They were carefully calculated so that anyone who stepped inside must feel that they themselves were incredibly small and weak. The gold-covered prison and the silence of the ruled. The luxury of Windsor, under the era of Edward III, often obscures the truth that it had always remained a bloody prison. In the year 1357, after the glorious Battle of Poitiers, the English army captured King John II of France alive, along with countless high-ranking nobles. They were escorted back and imprisoned right at Windsor Castle. While the Knights of the Order of the Garter raised their glasses to celebrate the victory above in the magnificent grand halls, the royal guests of France were kept under house arrest, like expensive merchandise, waiting for a massive ransom that would exhaust an entire nation across the sea. But the most heartbreaking thing always belonged to those at the bottom of society. Draining geniuses and lives. We know that the first weight-driven mechanical clock of England was installed on the Round Tower in the year 1354. We know the great writer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales, once worked as the inspector supervising the construction works here. This castle always knew how to attract and absorb the most outstanding geniuses of the era into every single one of its bricks. However, not a single record tells us how many stonemasons slipped and fell from the white chalk cliff, how many carpenters were permanently disabled, how many cheap, measly coins of silver were they paid, and did they remain alive to return to their families at the end of the day or not? Once again, the people who built this grand setting were erased from history. They carried heavy blocks of stone upon their backs to build the Temple of Loyalty, while they themselves did not have a single choice other than to submit. The greatness of Windsor continued to be watered with sweat and silence. Chapter 4. The Masterpiece of Ostentation and the Ghosts of the Tudor Era, the 15th, 16th century. When the dark shadow of the wars temporarily stepped back, Windsor put on a new shell, fake piety. From the end of the 15th century to the dynasty of the Tudor family, the castle was not just a military fortress, but it was used as a strategic chessboard to show off wealth, debauchery, and to serve as a shield covering the ultimate fears of the royal family. The Gothic Temple, when the ego disguises itself as religion, 1475. In the year 1475, King Edward IV ordered the commencement of the construction of St. George's Chapel in the Lower Ward area. It took more than half a century for this great Gothic architectural masterpiece to be completed. Stepping inside the chapel, light pierces through the brilliant stained glass prisms, reflecting onto the towering stone-vaulted ceilings. Everything is exquisitely designed to reach up to the high heavens, making humans marvel at the power of God. But, in reality, it is a giant monument to the immeasurable power of the king. Lives that were not priced. History has an incredibly cruel way of recording. Along the choir area of the chapel are oak benches, elaborately carved from the year 1478. The entrance is protected by exquisitely forged iron gates. Thanks to the accounting record books, we know the name of the chief blacksmith, John Tressilian. He was recorded for one single reason. He was expensive, with an extremely high salary of 16 pence a day. The name Tressilian survived throughout the centuries. However, thousands of other bloody hands that molded this masterpiece sank into oblivion. The royal family carefully listed every silver coin spent on materials, but the human cost and the lives of those at the bottom of society were never a category that needed to be accounted for. The Tudor dynasty, the extreme luxury and the cowardly shield. The Tudor family is famous for squeezing everything they touched dry, and Windsor was no exception. For them, this castle was a versatile tool. At times it was a stage for festivals, at other times it was a bunker. King Henry VIII, the cruel megalomaniac. He reconstructed the entire main gate of the castle and even built a tennis court right at the foot of the ancient mound. Henry VIII organized parties for the Order of the Garter that were so luxurious and crowded that the scale of the royal retinue had to be restricted because there was no longer enough room to accommodate them. Fleeing the outrage 1536. Megalomania is often accompanied by fear. When the rebellion Pilgrimage of Grace broke out in the north in the year 1536, aimed at opposing the brutality of the throne, Henry VIII immediately fled. He huddled deep inside Windsor Castle, used the stone walls that were 7 meters thick, built by his ancestors, as a shield, and from there cowardly directed bloody massacres to suppress his very own subjects. The saving coat of paint of Queen Elizabeth I, the 1570s. After the years of debauchery of the previous generation, Queen Elizabeth I stepped onto the throne and realized this great fortress was falling into a terribly dilapidated state. She spent the entire decade of the 1570s to salvage the glory of Windsor. Elizabeth I added new magnificent areas, including a long gallery overlooking the North Terrace, the place that later became the Royal Library. Under the hands of the House of Tudor, Windsor excellently fulfilled the role of a stage for showing off power and a solid bunker. But not a single one of these arrogant monarchs could have suspected that, entering only the next century, those very invulnerable defensive walls would turn backwards, becoming a bloody prison, incarcerating and swallowing the people carrying royal blood. Chapter 5. The Treacherous Wall and the Beheaded King in the Snowy Storm Night, the 17th century. Throughout many centuries, Windsor Castle was molded to protect the throne from threats from the outside. But dictators often forget an ironic truth. Walls that are thick enough to prevent enemies from stepping in are also the exact walls that are solid enough to lock you tightly on the inside. In the 17th century, the monster Windsor turned its back, biting back at its very own masters. The collapse of the royal aura, 1642. When the English Civil War broke out, the invulnerable fortress of the royal family fell. In the year 1642, the parliamentarian forces under the command of Colonel John Venn successfully besieged and captured the castle. In just the blink of an eye, the great symbol of authority was stripped clean of all its dignity. Windsor was turned into a noisy military barracks and a gloomy prison to incarcerate royalist officers. The victors did not hesitate to trample on the legacy of the kings from previous generations. St. George's Chapel, the Gothic masterpiece that once consumed mountains of money, was looted without mercy. The insignias of the Order of the Garter, the thing that was once revered as the symbol of absolute loyalty, were stripped off and thrown into the black mud. Oliver Cromwell, the supreme leader of the parliamentarian faction, even seized the castle to serve as his base, and after proclaiming himself as Lord Protector, he turned this place into his official residence. A person who did not carry royal blood now sat proudly right on the throne of Windsor, completely overturning the order of power that had existed for centuries. The last 3 weeks of a crowned prisoner, winter of 1649. But the darkest, bloodiest chapter of Windsor only truly opened in the winter of the year 1649. King Charles I, who was by this time a fallen prisoner of the Parliament, was escorted back to Windsor Castle itself, under the heavy surveillance of gun barrels. He was kept under house arrest here during the last 3 weeks of his reign, before being brought to court with the charge of treason and receiving the death penalty. The king who once possessed everything was now stripped of everything, sitting huddled and desperate in the rooms that used to be the safest fortress of his family. On the 30th of January 1649, at Whitehall in London, Charles I was led out to the execution scaffold. In the final moments of his life, the pride of a monarch was still gasping for breath. He requested to wear 2 shirts to fight against the skin-cutting cold of the winter. The reason? He was afraid that if his body trembled because of the cold, the crowd of people thirsting for blood below would mistakenly think that he was trembling with fear. The axe blade swung down. The king lost his head. The executioner raised the bloody severed head high in front of the crowd, but he remained completely silent, not daring to shout the familiar phrases because he was afraid that his voice would be recognized and he would then bring fatal disaster upon himself. The White Return Journey and the Silent Tomb. The 7th of February 1649. The following day, the head of King Charles I was sewn back onto his corpse. His body was hastily embalmed with chemicals and placed into a cold lead coffin. On the night of February 7th, the coffin was escorted back to Windsor Castle. There were no tens of thousands of mourners. There were no sorrowful bells stirring the hearts of people. When the coffin, covered in black velvet, was carried to the west end of St. George's Chapel, a fierce snowstorm suddenly struck. The stark white snowflakes completely covered the pitch-black layer of fabric. A witness present that night sorrowfully recorded that the snow fell as if carrying the color of innocence. Charles I was brought down to the dark crypt beneath the chapel, lying in the same place with the megalomaniac King Henry VIII and Queen Jane Seymour. Not a single royal funeral ritual was conducted. Not a single prayer from the Book of Common Prayer was chanted. The faith that he had dedicated his whole life and his very life to protect. Not a single word was uttered. That night, in the terrifying silence of the snowstorm, Windsor Castle softly opened its mouth again. It had just swallowed yet another king into the eternal dark space beneath its white chalk foundation. Chapter 6. The Restoration Play and the Madhouse of the Royal Family. The late 17th century, 18th century. After swallowing the headless corpse of Charles I, Windsor Castle seemed to have fulfilled its bloody mission. However, this white chalk monster never knew how to sleep peacefully. When the monarchy was restored, it continued to transform itself again, changing into a new skin that was more sparkling, more luxurious, and also more deceitful than ever before. The gold-covered revenge play of Charles II, 1660. In the year 1660, King Charles II stepped onto the throne with a deep obsession. He had to wipe clean the humiliating stain that the parliamentarian faction and Oliver Cromwell had smeared upon his family. And there was no better way to show off the rebirth of the royal family than turning the bloody prison of his father into a marvel. Charles II did not want a fortress. He wanted a theater of luxury capable of outshining even the Palace of Versailles of France. Under the hands of architect Hugh May, Windsor underwent the most insane Baroque major surgery ever seen in England. The dark ceilings were covered by painter Antonio Verrio, with brilliant frescoes, flooded with images of gods bowing their heads before the royal authority. The rough oak panels were carved by artisan Grinling Gibbons into exquisite masterpieces. Windsor Castle at this time was no longer a place to live. It was a giant prop designed to overwhelm the vision and knock down the will of anyone who stepped inside. The megalomania of Charles II even spilled outside the walls. He ordered the planting of the Long Walk, a perfectly straight avenue stretching up to 3 miles, nearly 5 kilometers, piercing through from the castle to the Great Park. With 1,652 elm trees planted at exactly calculated centimeter distances from each other, this was not a love for nature. This was the ambition to force nature to line up neatly at the foot of the throne. The desire to dominate was measured in earth and wood. The century of dust and oblivion, but the artificial glamour could not cover up the cold nature of Windsor. Right after Charles II passed away, the kings of subsequent generations began to realize the truth. Living inside Windsor was no different than living in a sparkling crypt. King William III fled to Hampton Court. Queen Anne would rather huddle in a tiny house outside the defensive walls than have to sleep in those giant rooms. The first kings of the House of Hanover almost completely ignored it. For almost an entire century, the greatest castle of England was left abandoned, submerged in darkness, and the Baroque-style layers of gold and paint were simply covered in dust. The monster was starved, waiting for its next prey. Awakening the Monster, the Golden Cage of King George III, 1760 to 1811. And that prey was exactly King George III. Ascending to the throne in the year 1760, and being the father of 15 children, George III needed a giant space. He decided to awaken Windsor, despite the warning of his very own mother, Queen Charlotte, who shuddered to describe Windsor as the coldest house, rooms, and corridors that have ever existed on this earth. To dispel that coldness, George III threw more than 150,000 British pounds, a massive fortune at that time, to the architect James Wyatt to mold onto the castle a fake Gothic exterior, adding watchtowers and useless arrow slits merely to serve for aesthetics. He hoarded paintings and photographs and expanded the surrounding farms and lakes. He thought that he was taming Windsor, turning it into a real home. But he was mistaken. The stone walls began to close in. In the year 1788, right during a dinner party at the castle, George III suddenly fell ill. The illness was diagnosed as a mysterious madness syndrome. Initially, he was taken for treatment and seemed to recover, but the bouts of madness continuously returned, devastating his mind more fiercely. By the year 1811, the most powerful king of the British Empire was stripped of all authority, yielding the throne to his son to act as regent. George III at this time was completely blind, had lost his mind, and frequently muttered in delusion. And where was he locked up? Right in the luxurious rooms of Windsor Castle. The cruel irony of history repeated itself once again. Windsor, the thing that was born to incarcerate Charles I, now became the madhouse keeping under house arrest the very king who had poured mountains of money to restore it. The great walls molded to keep enemies on the outside, ultimately turned into a golden cage, locking tightly a shattered monarch on the inside. The castle did not only drain the treasury, it had begun to corrode even the minds of those who dared to call it home. Chapter 7. The Historical Deception and the Hollow Crown of King George IV, the 19th Century. When King George III breathed his last breath in silence and blindness, Windsor Castle seemed to be forever associated with a terrifying title, the Madhouse of the royal family. But his succeeding son, King George IV, had no intention of living in a mental hospital. George IV was a megalomaniac, addicted to ostentation and obsessed with architecture to the point of paranoia. When he ascended to the throne in the year 1820, he looked at Windsor Castle not with the eyes of a monarch needing a fortress, but with the eyes of a director seeking a theatrical stage. And on this stage he prepared to execute the greatest architectural deception in the history of England, the accomplice named Wyattville 1824. George IV was determined to turn Windsor into the ultimate symbol of the power of the British Empire, something great enough to trample upon the legacy of the Palace of Versailles. In the year 1824, the British Parliament naively approved a budget of 300,000 British pounds for the renovation project. To realize this ambition, the king hired the architect, Geoffrey Wyatt, a man so hungry for fame that as soon as he received the royal contract, he changed his last name to Wyattville to sound more aristocratic. Wyattville moved straight into living in the Winchester Tower at the castle and began an insane plan. Instead of preserving history, he decided to rewrite it with a fake outer shell. The idea of Wyattville was very clear. Erase all the patching of previous centuries, and force the entire Upper Ward area to put on a uniform, romantic Gothic architectural cloak, exactly as if stepping out of fairy tale novels. The hollow stone crown. If you type the keyword Windsor Castle on the internet, the first image that appears is definitely the round tower, standing imposingly, reaching high and proud against the sky, dominating the entire surrounding landscape. But here is the cruel truth. That beautiful tower is a theatrical prop. At that time, the original round tower was an ancient defensive structure, short, crude, and unattractive. George IV and Wyatville could not accept that a royal symbol looked so ugly. So what did they do? Instead of tearing it down and rebuilding it, Wyatville added a stone crown up to 33 feet, about 10 meters high, covering the top of the old tower. This added section is completely hollow. It has no military function, no practical rooms. It is merely a fake shell implanted to deceive the vision of viewers from miles away. The greatest symbol of the endurance of the British royal family turned out to be a stone hoax erected to stroke the ego of a vain king. Spending money on blood and bones, and the price to pay, 1,828 to 1,830. Inside the castle, the extravagance reached an even more horrifying level. Wyatville roofed over a giant inner courtyard to create the Waterloo Chamber, a grand hall solely to celebrate the victory over Napoleon, with a dining table capable of accommodating 150 people. The royal rooms were stuffed with the most luxurious furniture in the style of the French Empire. Even a 15-year-old apprentice boy named Augustus Pugin participated in this project, the person who would later become one of the greatest architects of the 19th century. Windsor Castle, once again, drained the most outstanding talents of the era. What was the consequence? The initial budget of £300,000 was torn to shreds. The final total cost skyrocketed past the mark of £1 million British pounds, an insane number equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds today. Parliament was furious. The populace booed because their tax money was burned on the endless parties of the king. But George IV did not care. In December of the year 1828, he ignored the noise of hundreds of workers who were still digging and chiseling to move into living in his work of art. But the monster Windsor did not allow anyone to appropriate it for long. The health of George IV collapsed rapidly. On the 26th of June 1830, George IV breathed his last breath right on the bed in his brand new bedroom at the castle. The king, who had drained the national treasury, poured a massive fortune to turn Windsor into the greatest illusion of his life, ultimately only got to enjoy it for a mere period of less than 18 months. His megalomaniacal project was not even completed when he died. Once again, the truth was chillingly fulfilled. The house had chewed and swallowed the king long before the king had time to consume it. Chapter 8. The Tomb for the Living and the Ghost in the Blue Room, the 19th Century. George IV left for Windsor Castle, a magnificent shell bearing the appearance of a fairy tale kingdom. But fairy tales often have tragic endings, and with the next owner, Queen Victoria, Windsor was no longer a sparkling stage to show off power. It transformed into a machine-freezing time, a giant tomb imprisoning the living, a fleeting glimmer of light. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, her husband, first moved in, Victoria complained that this castle was boring, tiring, and like a prison. But it was Prince Albert who used his love and resourcefulness to breathe a soul into the cold stone walls. Albert directed the redesign of the estate, restored the watchtowers, and brought along a tradition from his homeland of Germany, the Christmas tree. For the first time, the castle was filled with the laughter of 9 children. For 2 decades, Windsor shed its gloomy atmosphere to truly become a family. The corridors that once witnessed kings going mad and losing their heads now echoed with the footsteps of life. But Windsor Castle never allowed warmth to exist for too long. It was inherently a monster, fed by blood and tears. The heart stops beating in the Blue Room, 1861. On the 14th of December, 1861, a fatal blow collapsed the world of Queen Victoria. Prince Albert, her only love and most solid pillar of support, breathed his last breath at the Blue Room inside the castle. He passed away when he was only 42 years old. The death of Albert was not just a family tragedy. It completely reshaped the appearance of the British royal family and turned Windsor Castle into a gloomy realm for many decades afterward. Queen Victoria fell into a deep pit of bottomless despair. Rejecting the capital, she refused to step foot into Buckingham Palace and completely locked herself behind the thick walls of Windsor. The writer Rudyard Kipling later called her by a haunting name, the Widow at Windsor, the Theatre of Ghosts. Victoria did not just mourn. She performed a ritual of psychological manipulation upon herself, forcing the entire giant castle to maintain the illusion that Prince Albert was still alive. She ordered that everything in the Blue Room be kept exactly as it was at the moment Albert breathed his last breath. But the obsession did not stop there. Every evening, the clothes of the deceased husband were still carefully laid out on the bed by the servants. Every morning, bowls of clean hot water were still brought into the room for him to wash his face. The Queen wandered in the dimly lit corridors, wearing pure black clothes, turning the place that used to be the most powerful fortress in the world into a giant temple for mourning. The invisible price of freezing. Can you imagine what was happening beneath that sorrowful shell? To maintain the illusion for a queen drowning in grief, hundreds of anonymous people had to work exhaustively like ghosts. The castle has more than 300 fireplaces, and all must be kept burning brightly to warm a cold building spanning 13 acres. This job was assigned to a fendersmith, a profession passed down from father to son, humans who were kept under house arrest their whole lives just to light fires for the empty rooms. Beneath the royal quarters, the servants still had to sullenly sweep, cook, and move through secret passages, ensuring that everything was always perfect, without being allowed to make a single sound that would disturb the sleepwalking realm of the Queen. Victoria once saw Windsor as a prison, but she herself voluntarily turned it into a tomb. This great castle excellently did what it was best at. It stripped away the life of those who ruled it, forcing them to pay the price for power with ultimate isolation, waiting for them to pass away, to make room for a tragic war that was waiting in the 20th century. Chapter 9. The Whitewashing Machine and the Fortress in the Darkness, first half of the 20th century. Entering the 20th century, wars were no longer decided by swords, spears, or arrows shot through door slits. Bombers in world wars threatened not only lives, but also threatened the survival of the monarchy itself. At this time, Windsor Castle executed the most spectacular transformation in its 1,000-year history. It did not only provide a physical shell, it provided a shell of identity. The greatest identity whitewashing in history, 1917. In the year 1917, the First World War was at a bloody stage. The British Empire was shedding blood in the trenches to fight against Germany. But there was an ironic and extremely dangerous truth threatening the throne. The blood flowing in the veins of the British royal family was actually German blood. Since the time of Prince Albert, the family ruling England carried the last name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Amidst the boiling wave of anti-German sentiment, this name was nothing short of a death sentence for the monarchy. The populace could overthrow them at any time. King George V needed a way out, and he found it right at this white chalk cliff. He decided to throw away his German origin last name and took the name of the castle to be the last name for the entire royal family, the House of Windsor. This was an astonishing reversal. Normally, people name buildings, but here, the stone walls named a dynasty. The castle excellently fulfilled the role of a giant PR machine. It whitewashed the foreign origin of the ruling family, cloaking them in a historical shirt deeply imbued with British identity. Windsor saved the throne with just a name. The renunciation originating from the icy core, 1936. But even when carrying the name of the castle, not every king could endure its weight. In the year 1936, King Edward VIII, who detested the suffocation of royal rules, sat before a microphone right inside Windsor Castle to broadcast a message that shocked the globe. He announced his abdication. The king chose love instead of the crown. The castle that once imprisoned, drained, and swallowed the most arrogant kings in history now became a silent witness, watching a monarch cast aside everything it represented and walk out of the door to seek freedom. The survival machine. In the darkness, 1939 to 1945. Just 3 years later, World War II broke out. Windsor shed the appearance of a magnificent palace to return to its ruthless primal nature, a war fortress. When the rain of bombs of Nazi Germany poured down on London, Windsor immediately became invisible. Thousands of blackout curtains were pulled down to cover every window, so that from the pitch-black sky, not a single pilot could recognize this stone crown. The royal treasures were kept hidden. The dark underground bunker area was converted into a bomb shelter. Even the two young princesses, Elizabeth, 13 years old, and Margaret, 9 years old, were brought here for secret evacuation, huddling behind the 7-meter-thick walls for the majority of the time of the war. There was a chilling contrast that took place during this period. The Waterloo Chamber, the giant hall where King George IV had poured mountains of money to proudly celebrate the victory over Napoleon, was now stripped of all its portraits of power. Instead, the walls were covered with temporary paper, painted with rustic fairy tale pictures to serve as a backdrop for the two young princesses performing plays to raise money to buy wool for the soldiers on the front line. The thing that was once the symbol of extreme megalomania was now forced to become humble to serve the life of a nation that was gasping for breath. And right in the room that once reeked of gunpowder and political calculations, a young naval officer named Philip sat in the front row watching Princess Elizabeth perform a play. Their love sprouted right in the heart of a war machine. The World War ended, the fairy tale painted wallpaper was peeled off to make way for the original artificial luxury. The secrets of the war were buried. The castle fell back asleep in its ostentation, but it did not know that a true fury from a great fire was waiting to swallow it ahead. Chapter 10. The Flame of Fury and the Collapse of an Illusion. 1992, Modern Era. Windsor Castle had survived thousands of years of tyrants, bloody civil wars, and the rain of bombs of the World War. The 7-meter-thick stone walls seemed to be able to challenge every enemy, but this monster did not expect that the fatal blow striking it would not come from the outside, but would originate from its very deep core inside. The final straw that ignited the Sea of Fire, the 20th of November, 1992. On the morning of the 20th of November, 1992, exactly on the occasion of the 45th wedding anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II, a faulty spotlight in the private chapel of Queen Victoria overheated and caught fire on the curtain next to the altar. In just the blink of an eye, the fire tore through the ceiling. Windsor Castle, the proud architectural block holding the priceless treasures of humanity, sank into an uncontrollable, fiery nightmare. For 15 hours, 225 firefighters desperately pumped 1.5 million gallons of water into the castle. Inside, a chaotic scene unfolded as Prince Andrew, along with soldiers and staff, formed living human chains, frantically rushing into the sea of smoke to pull out the paintings of Rembrandt, the antique clocks, and precious porcelain. When the fire was extinguished, 115 rooms were burned to the ground. The majestic St. George's Hall collapsed. But this physical fire was nothing compared to the political kindling that it had just ignited. The parasitic machine stripped bare. The first question raised after the ashes was not how do we repair it, but was who will pay the money. Windsor Castle was owned by the state, but it was not insured because it was too valuable. When the Heritage Secretary announced that the government, meaning the tax money of the people, would pay the entire restoration bill, estimated to be up to 60 million British pounds, England erupted into an unprecedented fury. A nation sinking in a severe economic recession was asked to tighten its belt to repair a palace for a royal family that possessed a massive fortune but did not pay any income tax at all. 90% of the British public fiercely protested. For the first time in history, the psychological illusion of Windsor lost its effect. The people no longer looked at it as a sacred symbol of national pride. They looked at it as a financial black hole, a parasitic machine sucking the blood of the working class. The surrender of the throne. Standing on the brink of an existential crisis directly threatening the survival of the monarchy, Queen Elizabeth II had to step back. She was forced to break the privileges that had existed for centuries. The Queen announced that she would personally pay £2 million out of her own pocket, and even more shockingly, she agreed to start paying personal income tax. the first British monarch to do this in more than half a century. To have enough money to restore Windsor, the Queen had to grit her teeth and open the doors of Buckingham Palace for ordinary citizens to buy tickets to enter and view. This event marked a bitter defeat of the monster Windsor. The castle that used to arrogantly squeeze the sweat, money, and lives of countless anonymous people without needing a reason was now stripped of its privileges. For the first time in 1,000 years, it could not just take away, it was forced to make its own money. The final illusion. The restoration was completed in the year 1997 at a cost of £36.5 million. St. D's. George's Hall was lifted up again from the ashes, with a beautiful English oak vaulted roof, looking as if it had been built in the 14th century. But in reality, hidden behind that ancient shell are the modern engineering techniques of the 20th century. In September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II passed away and was brought back to rest at the crypt inside St. George's Chapel, next to the monarchs of previous generations. The white chalk stone monster once again opened its mouth to welcome its greatest master of the modern era. If you stand at the foot of Windsor Castle today, looking up at the grey sky of England, you will still see a flawless picture of authority and endurance. But now, you know the truth. That proud round tower is merely a hollow 10-meter-high theatrical prop added on to deceive the vision. The romantic Gothic walls are fakes from the 19th century, built by the money thrown by a megalomaniacal king. The magnificent medieval rooms inside are actually artificial replicas reconstructed after the year 1992. Windsor Castle is not a building. It is 1,000 years of erasing, tearing down, and rewriting. It gave William violence, gave Edward a cult, gave George IV a stage, and gave Victoria a tomb. It satisfied all the darkest desires of power. But when you peel off all the fake crowns, the patched-up layers of gold and paint, and the deceitful epic tales, the only primitive and genuine thing left is the white chalk mound deep beneath the foundation. The mound that was built from the mud by the bleeding hands of anonymous Saxon slaves from 1,000 years ago. That mound is still there, silent beneath tens of thousands of tons of stone. It does not have a name. It is not recorded in the history books. But it is always there, constantly drilling into history, a single question. This epic song, whose blood was it ultimately bought with? Windsor Castle may have closed its gates in the video today, but it is absolutely not the only stone monster sleeping in England. If you think 1,000 years of deceiving and extorting lives by Windsor is a terrifying truth, then you are probably not ready for what we are about to discover. Located not far away, right in the center of the capital, is another fortress. A place that never bothered to cover up its cruel nature with romantic architecture. A place designed right from the first day as a giant political slaughterhouse. Where queens were beheaded. Where 2 little princes were kept under house arrest and disappeared without leaving a single trace. And it is the place where a flock of black ravens is still guarding a bleeding 1,000-year curse. Can you guess what place that is? History is always written by the victors, but the truth is always buried under the foundations of magnificent palaces. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that you do not miss our next trip when the dark mask of the Tower of London is stripped away. What fortress, palace, or family do you want us to decode the secrets of next? Please leave a comment right below. The stone walls are still waiting to tell you the truth. See you again in the next video.